right, that's great. Excellent, excellent. So what I'm going to be covering today in this presentation on basically embodiment as a theoretical tool in the study of religion, gender and sexuality. I want to explore what we mean by embodiment and where embodiment has been situated within the sociology of religion, but also what a somewhat different perspective from a queer feminist perspective, what that might look like. And I also want to end on some new theoretical agendas as well. So what I'm basically drawing on is some of the publications that I've been working on recently. Predominantly this presentation will relate to the Embodying Religion, Gender and Sexuality edited collection. But also I'll be drawing on the Religion and Sexualities book, which is the bottom one that I co-wrote with Heather Shipley, and also Intersecting Religion and Sexuality that I wrote with Andrew Yip, and that's another edited collection. So what do we mean by embodiment? We experience the world through our bodies, and this has an enormous impact on how we navigate the world. So as Howson says, we do not simply have bodies, but we are bodies. So the body is central to our social experience as well. So that sort of might be quite an obvious statement to make about how we experience bodies, but bodies are never neutrally defined. So bodies get classed, they get raced, they get gendered. Bodies get catalogued and categorized. So we do not have ultimate control over how our bodies are read. And I really welcome the work of Poir, who did a fantastic study some years ago of the UK civil service, and argued that, that there is something called the somatic norm, the normative body, and that's the body that gets deemed neutral in society. So that body is the white, male, middle class, able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgendered body, and other bodies are deemed less in some way against that sort of schema. So as Poir says, some bodies are deemed as having the right to belong, while others are marked out as trespassers, who are, in accordance with how both spaces and bodies are imagined, politically, historically and conceptually, circumscribed as being out of place. Not being the somatic norm, they are space invaders. That's quite a powerful idea, this idea of certain bodies being situated as space invaders. So when we look at where religion has been situated in terms of the body, I guess one of the most significant texts has been Brian Turner's Body and Society. And so this was a work that was really part of the rediscovery of the body within sociology. But as a sociologist of religion, Turner had religion at the forefront of his analysis. And, given that we often encounter lots of disciplinary disconnections between religion and the theory within sociology and religion, as has been explained by people like Jim Beckford, it's interesting that actually this really key text, there was so much about religion in it because of Turner's own interests. And the book has been extremely influential. There's numerous new editions that have emerged. And a key issue that Turner covers is the ways in which bodies have been controlled in relation to to sexuality and gender, and how that has been channeled through religious processes. So, for example, Turner examines how religious ideas fed into inheritance processes in medieval society. For example, anyone surplus to requirements in the system of primogeniture could be sent to the religious houses as a monk or a nun, for example. Meanwhile, property was passed through the male line, with women acting as the subordinate players in all of this, and their value was determined through their breeding capacity as well as their sexual purity. So you've got a high concern and interest in issues around virginity and the control of women's bodies, as well as Christian, and this is often rooted through the Christian concept of sin, for example. Now, as society changes, Turner is mapping how this system is upended by new economic processes, Enlightenment thinking, and increasing secularization. So in a capitalist system, Turner argues that a greater level of disruption is allowed in terms of family formations. So the system can cope with more disruptions, such as higher levels of divorce, and that becoming normative, and women having greater rights, such as access to the economic sphere in their own right. But my issue with Turner's analysis is the way in which he presents a rather optimistic view regarding what the implications are for gender and sexual autonomy. And he has little time for a feminist analysis. He's pretty dismissive of feminist approaches. And Turner instead argues that patriarchal systems have been severely eroded, and because of secularization processes, religion then having little impact on the control of bodies. So there's less of a focus on the sort of the everyday sexism and the structural nature of that in the contemporary moment. So the book that I've edited with Katie Pilcher, that well, it was published the very last day of last year, but it's formally a 2021 publication, is actually how bodies are structured through heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is a valorization of heterosexuality, and that is a structuring experience. So I guess conventionally you might think that heteronormative, if you're valorizing heterosexuality, then that's going to most severely impact on queer bodies and the regulation of queer bodies. But heteronormative, the heterosexuality itself has its own hierarchy. So it's also regulating all bodies within the system to determine the extent to which you are living up to the ideals of heterosexuality. So you can actually have even quite a queer supportive society, but at the root of it still has the sort of valorization of heterosexuality. So, one of the key criticisms of same-sex marriage, for example, is the idea that this is promoting a certain view of heterosexuality, and it's creating a particular value system and a new hierarchy, even though it includes more bodies, but there's still this system that you have to sort of live up against. So heteronormativity is negatively impacting queer bodies as well as women's bodies, because women's bodies carry the symbolism of communities. So it's on women's bodies that virginity codes have been written. Where, meanwhile, queer bodies have been sanctioned through social systems that either deny queer bodies a space at all, or relegate them to inferior subjectivities. And it's interesting where religions lie in that, because although religions are often presenting themselves as having always having a continuous understanding of sexuality, there are these changes that you can note. And one of the changes that you can note, for example, in some forms of conservative Christianity, for example, is how it might not be the full denial of a queer body, but you might have certain sanctions on what you are allowed or not allowed to do. So, for example, celibacy. So the queer body is expected to be celibate, for example. So, these are sort of kinds of morally appropriate sects that are mandated by certain conservative traditions that end up causing harm. So, one example being queer people who are told to be celibate within their religious communities. Also, theorists like Patricia B.T. Young has talked about how Christian marriage, where vaginal sex is prioritised for its procreative assumptions, downplaying sexual pleasure, and that the harms created there as well. So because heteronormative structures are wide-ranging, Pilcher and I have separately argued for a queer feminist approach. So we don't delve into it in this particular publication, but Katie Pilcher has written about it in her own publications. Heather Shipley and I wrote about a queer feminist approach in the Religion and Sexualities book. And the reason for that is that it's recognizing the structuring system of heteronormativity as impacting lots of different groups. So rather than sort of separating out queer analysis, gender analysis and so forth, it's about sort of bringing that together and pulling that all together. So we didn't have space to specifically explore that within this particular book you're seeing here on embodying religion, gender and sexuality in a very short introduction that we had. But ultimately, this is the starting point that we both have that's underpinning this. I've got intersectionality and live religion on there. I'm gonna come back to those. I'll mention those again in a little bit. So what Katie Pilcher and I do in the introduction to the embodiment book is we conceptually frame embodiment in terms of 6 different processes, and how we've come up with these 6 facets of embodiment is really in conjunction with the book as a whole. You know, we've got lots of different authors in that book, lots of different perspectives, and you know, it was sort of our communal thinking about how we understand embodiment in relation to you know, to those chapters. So I'm just going to take you through the conceptual framing and the different facets of the conceptual framing now. So the first one is space, and I've already started to reference space given Poir's work on bodies out of place. So when certain bodies enter particular spaces, they're not welcome. So space relates the extent to which bodies are enabled to fit or not within a given space. And we take the view that spaces do not just exist out there, but spaces are socially constructed. We don't believe spaces are neutral either, but spaces are infused with certain boundary maintenance. So who gets included and on what basis, and who gets excluded. So we use Poir's, I've already mentioned, the somatic norm, and just to remind everyone, the somatic norm being the white middle class man, and everyone gets measured against that somatic norm. So our theorization is basically about, you know, who gets included and who gets excluded. But in relation to space, you've also got time and how time also structures and how time is also something that's socially constructed. So if we think about Western time in relation to gendered and sexual bodies, Western time is understood in very linear terms. So one is born, one grows up, one gets married, one has children, one dies, and then the cycle continues. So it's very much tied to a reproductive cycle. And that's a very heteronormative structuring of life that religions themselves have had a vested interest in, because, you know, it's religions that are often utilised at key moments within the life cycle, whether that's the birth of a child and particular ceremonies surrounding that, whether it be marriage, for example. And, you know, not all, but predominantly, you know, there's a huge amount of investment in things like heterosexual marriage from religious traditions. So Bolestorff calls this straight time, the straight time model, and how this is sort of structuring experiences of bodies. So I guess it doesn't go without saying that we're starting to also hint at power and the role that power is playing in the regulation of bodies. So power is fundamental to understanding embodiment. So, you know, you can look at Foucault's work, for example, on the confession, and how the narrative of the confession brought into being the naming of sexual practices. So the priest would make a decision regarding whether the sexual practice was licit or illicit. Basically, this divides sexual practices between the normative and the deviant, and the power is rooted through the priest in this example to make those decisions. So that's sort of the historical approach, you know, but we can look at the contemporary manifestation of power and how powerful discourses emerge. The fourth facet of embodiment that we have is relationality. So relationality is about how bodies communicate and relate with other bodies. And I'll quote Pilcher and myself now. We say, relationships form the basis of how we understand ourselves, what is important and what is ethical. So, you know, how do we understand what is inappropriate and appropriate behaviour? So that's something that's devised collectively, the collective norms that are relationally produced. But at the same time, we've also got, you know, that sort of sexual activities that are, you know, they can take, you know, often take a relational form. Projects of the self is the fifth element. So that's about the body work that we do and the process of discipline that we place on the body. So the way in which the contemporary subject is far more responsible for their own discipline and the self-regulation there. So we're all regulating our own bodies, and you can follow the sort of the historical trajectory of that, going back to Norbert Elias's work on civilizing processes, for example. And this is a recognition about the sort of the socially constructed nature of the project of the self, that where the body is never a finished project, it's always socially constituted and it's becoming something. So we're constantly changing, and you know, the sort of the becoming body being central. And that also points to questions regarding the extent to which our bodies are aligned with our identities, how we modify the body, and how, you know, I guess that question of, you know, our individual choices in relation to the broader structures in which we are find ourselves. And the final component that we've got for understanding embodiment is the projects, in particular relation to religion, is the projects of religious and spiritual communities. So bodies are crucial for communities themselves to be created, and religious and spiritual communities have enact borders and who is inside and who is outside of those borders. So gendered and sexual embodiment becomes crucial lenses through which the community body as a whole is read. So just to pull on an example from my research, what was really interesting is when young people who came out as, say, gay or lesbian to their parents in conservative traditions, the parents might actually be accepting of their child's sexual identification. And the parents say, well, we will accept you, but we cannot let anyone in the community know about your sexual identity. This would cause problems, this would cause issues. So an immediate family level, the identity of the child, the sexual identity of the child is accepted, but it's about that more broader community censorship that's going on. And, you know, we found this quite a bit within the Religion, Youth and Sexuality project we did 10 years ago, that I did with Andrew Yip and Mike Keenan, about community censure and control of bodies, and, you know, the sort of, and other work as well, of course. I mean, a project that I'm frequently using in my own work is Bernadette Barton's book, Pray the Gay Away. And she's writing about the Bible Belt in the United States, and the collective geography of belonging that continues to censure and control the queer body. So the repercussions of not fitting in, and how this sort of pervades the whole of social life within that particular geographical context. So what did this embodied approach allow then? So the book itself is divided into 3 different sections. And I'm not going to have space to sort of talk about every single chapter, but I'm just going to give you a flavour of how we structured the book. So the first theme that we explored was how, if we're taking embodiment and the body as a central starting point, it undermines a strict demarcation between religion and the secular. And this idea that bodies are complex entities that do not fit neatly into either a sacred or a secular box. So Brenda Barthelink and Jelle Waring, for example, I think you're on the call, so hello to you both, look at the Dutch sexual healthcare programmes and argue that the educational programmes that are set up in a confession style manner is seen as sexually beneficial, and that the appropriate and right way of delivering sex education. But they argue that that's underpinned by secular normatives, assuming that religious ways of approaching sexuality are backward in some way, and this idea that constructing the classroom in these sort of more secular terms is a much more progressive approach. But what they're analysing is the harms for religious participants, and the lack of recognition of those harms from the secular educators. So the educators are trying to coax the sexual story out of religious individuals, to use Ken Plummer's terms, but the negative consequences of that. And another chapter in the book, Lieke Schrijvers, looks at the experiences of women who have converted to religions like Judaism and Islam, and how this generates particular negative assumptions about them and what their perspective is going to be on equality issues in relation to gender and sexuality. So there's this assumption that religious space is always going to be negative to sexual and gender equality, failing to capture the diversity of real religious bodies. The second part of the book is looking at and examining power, regulation and resistance. So Katie Pilcher's chapter, for example, examines orgasmic meditation. So orgasmic meditation, and she's examining this in the United States and also in the UK, as a complex practice that enables bodily trauma to be addressed, for example. So, this is a means of being able to sort of seek control when something really negative has happened to the body. And orgasmic meditation, for those that aren't familiar, it's a goal-oriented exercise that's in very strict conditions where the clitoris is stroked for a set period of time under very specific conditions. So it's a very interesting community of practice, and what Pilcher is examining there is that old norms about the body can be challenged, but at the same time new powerful configurations can be identified as well, and with the gendering of bodies being at the centre of that. Meanwhile, Jo Henderson-Marigold looks at how the cis body has been dominantly constructed in existing understandings of biblical texts. So Henderson-Marigold argues for new readings of biblical characters. I mean, in this particular case, Henderson-Marigold is examining Jacob and the story of Jacob, and how the sacred text has been regulated in a particular way because of the way it is understood bodies. So this dominant construction of bodies has had an impact on the hermeneutical readings of the Bible there. The third part of the book examines body symbolism and the symbolism of bodies. So Alison Halford, for example, is examining the experiences of reproductive failure within the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And so women who do not have children, and there's this expectation for motherhood runs so high within this community, what are the implications of that when their bodies are seen in these terms of reproductive failure? And again, how one reconfigures one's body in relation to the religious community, and how that happens. And lastly, I'll just mention George Amaka's chapter, who examines the experiences of Nigerian unmarried women in Nigeria, and how their bodies are policed by religious communities, often to harsh effects. So again, thinking about the relationship between bodies and the boundary maintenance of communities. So that's taken us a sort of a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the book that I did with Katie Pilcher on embodiment. But my thinking has been shaped through these sort of three different books that I've been writing about, that I mentioned at the start. So over the summer, sort of thinking about the implications of the different theoretical work that I've been doing, and the three books, so where am I now sort of theoretically? And I guess what I'm thinking about is how we can link embodiment to other key theories. So this is about pushing the agenda harder, I guess, and moving this beyond embodiment. So firstly, I want to talk about lived religion, and Maguire's been incredibly influential here. So lived religion, I guess most people will have an awareness of this, but lived religion is very much a sort of a bottom-up approach to religion. So rather than looking at the sort of authorized versions of religion, it's about examining religion as lived. And rather than trying to determine whether somebody is authentically living out a religious faith or not, it's actually taking seriously the religious practices that people engage with. So very much focus on practices. And sort of not making assumptions about whether somebody is properly practicing their religion. So I guess the easiest, the way that I explain this often to my students, and I guess this is a well often utilised idea, is when you're looking at these papal encyclical banning artificial forms of contraception. But when you have Catholic populations who have access to artificial forms of contraception, it's typically utilised. So this is a disjuncture between what the church authorities are saying one should do and not use contraception versus what Catholics on the ground do. So rather than saying these individuals are being inauthentic Catholics or not doing their Catholicism properly, it's actually trying to understand their perspective and their positioning and taking that seriously, and not sort of trying to measure them up against some list of religious edicts that they apparently should be following. So it's very much this lived bottom-up approach. And in terms of how this links with embodiment, there's lots of people that have taken a lived religion approach, but Maguire has done a huge amount to sort of situate embodiment and lived religion together as linked concepts, emphasising that religion is experienced through real material bodies, with socialization processes, for example, being heavily embodied, so when one is socialized into religion, how that's a really embodied process. So just to quote Maguire, she says, human bodies matter because those practices, even interior ones, such as contemplation, involve people's bodies, as well as their minds and spirits. Material bodies are also linked to spirituality through healing, sexuality and gender, through fertility, childbirth and nursing, and a myriad other forms of embodied practices. Meanwhile, an intersectional approach is invested with understanding the complexity of how social inequalities get reproduced. So it's moving beyond a class-only, gender-only, ethnicity-only framing to instead recognise identities as enmeshments of privilege and disadvantage. And although a lot of the early work, coming out of the Black feminist tradition, was very much interested in the multiple oppressions experienced by Black working class women, for example, intersectionality is about this sort of how inequality gets configured and the differences that result depending on those alterations in one's identity. So how the experience of a working class white woman and a Black middle class man, how their experiences of discrimination, inclusion and exclusion are going to differ in certain ways. But it's, Andrew Yip and I point this out in our book about how intersectionality has not really been utilised in the sociology of religion. It's a cornerstone idea, particularly within feminism. It's often utilised in sociology, but it hasn't been as readily utilised within the study of religion. So that's the introduction to lived religion and intersectionality. So, what do we do now? So what I'm proposing by pushing the agenda further is to think about these as linked concepts. So intersectionality, lived religion, and embodiment as interconnected, interlinked concepts. So I'm just going to take you through that. So I've already noted Meredith Maguire. I've already sort of talked about this element of the cycle where we've got lived religion and embodiment in tandem with each other. And Meredith Maguire's work does that very well. Next, I want to talk about Heidi Merz's work, who has theorized embodied intersectionality. So embodied intersectionality is a means of conceptually heightening and extending the concept of intersectionality. And I'm just going to quote Mirza now. And she's looking at Muslim women. So, her framework, her analysis is focused on Muslim women. And she says, embodied intersectionality not only seeks to theorize the complexities of race, gender, class, and other positional social divisions as lived realities, i.e. how the women experience the world holistically as a Muslim, middle class, heterosexual woman, but also interrogates how this experience is effectively mediated by the body and lived through Muslim female subjectivity. Thereby, by centralising the body, it becomes a good way of understanding the rootings and effects of power in the formation of inequality. So by bringing them together, a much more powerful theoretical tool is utilised in being able to understand inequality. Now, I've already mentioned the work that Andrew Yip and I have done on intersectionality, and in that book, we actually conceptually link intersectionality and lived religion. So we emphasize how lived religion can be deployed intersectionally. So we note the similarities between the concepts. Both of these concepts of intersectionality and lived religion are concerned with everyday practices. Both recognize complexity and fluidity, and both take marginalized bodies seriously. And despite sociology of religion not prioritizing intersectionality as a theoretical frame, we argue that lived religion can be utilised as an intersectional concept, which may also enable the sociology of religion to become more inclusive of different religious bodies. And this is important because my argument is that the study of religion has typically focused on middle-class identities. Christian subjectivities has also been a dominant focus. White religious adherence has been a dominant focus. And we need to move our frameworks beyond this. And this is about, developing a theoretical means to do so. So we need to recognise complex subjectivities as well. The person who adopts multiple religious identities, who sees themselves equally as a Buddhist as well as a Christian, for example. Who is getting missed out of our account? So, looking at my particular research field, very little on Sikhism and sexuality, for example, very little on Black women's experience of religion within the UK. And I'm sure we can all identify research gaps in our own field. So for me, a queer feminist approach, which is about the margins, it's about recognising who's being marginalised, and de-seating centralities of power. That's sort of my underpinning approach. But these three concepts for me give a really clear way and an inclusive way of doing the sociology of religion that's thoroughly taking into account power dynamics. It's recognising real bodies, and it's doing that in the context of religion. So I'm basically pretty much out of time, so I've not really had much chance to really link this to some of the empirical work that I do, but I'll just briefly say, so we can probably pick this up if you like in the Q&A, but thinking through some of the work that I've been doing, for example, on anti-abortion activists. So for the last 5 years, I've undertaken with Pam Lowe an ethnography of anti-abortion activists, so individuals who specifically situate themselves in the public sphere to oppose abortion. And these are highly conservative voices that you don't necessarily hear in religion and sexuality research, because the body of research has typically prioritised speaking to those who are negatively impacted by conservative religious agendas, and rightly so. Those stories absolutely need to be heard. But again, this is sort of a project in broadening what happens when we do hear these conservative voices. How do we make sense of that? How do we do justice to that, whilst also recognising the very narrow and essentialised understandings of bodies that such groups typically maintain in relation to the body? I also want to flag up young people and children. So there's an emerging body of work that's recognising the importance of taking children's voices seriously in religion research. So actually speaking, designing research projects so that we're actually speaking to children. So Rachel Shillitoe, Celine Benoit, Anna Strahan, for example. And 10 years ago, when we were doing the Religion, Youth and Sexuality project, it was, the importance really of listening. I mean, these weren't children, but young people's voices who were often being talked about, but not being spoken to. So there was lots of assumptions being made about their sex education curriculum and what it was perceived that they needed to be, when actually they found this stifling and out of touch and irrelevant. And actually, if you'd just spoken to the young people, it would give you a rather different perspective. And I also just want to flag up the emergence of the emerging evidence around child sexual abuse as well in religious organisations, and how children were not allowed a voice, and indeed were disbelieved and just completely dismissed when they did bring to the attention of authorities abuse. So these horrific abuses that have been suffered, which religious organisations have covered up, to protect their reputations as a form of damage limitation, but in the process have put other children at risk. So this is profound, because it's the absolute moral failure of institutions that set themselves up as being the moral compasses in society. So, for example, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales, it's generated pages and pages, thousands of pages of testimony. So how much will that become part of the public consciousness, and how much will that be sort of reroute, and change things to enable marginalised voices to be heard and to change things for the better? The news media only picks up a fraction of what ICSA is uncovering. So is this a moment for the stories to be heard, or does the silence continue? So one of the criticisms by survivors of one of the more recent ICSA reports was that it enabled religious authorities much space to defend themselves. And, it goes back to who gets the voice, who gets the power, who gets to define the agenda. Right, so I'm going to finish there on my conclusion. So really, what does applying a queer feminist approach to sociology of religion enable us to do? It's examining things from the position of the margins, as bell hooks would talk about. And Pilcher argues, and I'll quote Pilcher here, a queer feminist approach can bring to the fore how both gender and sexuality are constructed in ways that centre them with hierarchical social divisions, recognising that the power of normalising discourses in particular contribute to reproducing structural inequalities. And for me, this is what sociology is about. It's about examining inequalities, how they emerge, and a means of sort of an agenda for change and developing more equal and egalitarian processes. And my argument in the sociology of religion is that we can do this by linking together the concepts of lived religion, intersectionality, and embodiment. And there's a need for the sociology of religion to diversify, to move beyond the privileging of whiteness, Christianity, heterosexuality, and so forth. So the question that I leave you with is, where do our research priorities lie, and what theoretical tools do we need to push our research further? And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.